Welcome to the Real News. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Baltimore. Recently, I have been going around the country looking at the Flint water crisis and to do a follow-up on that to find out what's happening in other cities beyond Flint in reference to water, including Baltimore. I have joining me now a radio talk show host, community activist, Eugene Puryear. Eugene, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Eddie. We really appreciate it.
Can you give us an overview of what's happening with the water systems in other cities as well as Flint?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty stunning when you look at it. Many people forget, but shortly after the Flint crisis broke, USA Today actually did a study and found over 2,000 localities that had levels of lead in the water that were actually higher than Flint. That was in early 2017. They did that study. Reuters then subsequently later in that year did a similar study where they looked at about 3,000 census tracts. They actually looked at more than that, but they found about 3,000 census tracts around the country that also had higher lead levels in water, and also in terms of the lead blood level than what we were finding in people in Flint. And I think when we look at the places where it's the worst, we're finding it's either inner cities, quote unquote, in places like Milwaukee has a huge issue, Chicago, Baltimore, Cleveland, but also in a number of sort of rural areas and smaller towns. And I think the common denominator between all of those are places where there's either deliberate disinvestment or because there is just not as much going on there in terms of the economy. People with wealth and so on and so forth. There has also been disinvestment in the infrastructure. So it's an interesting mix of the two, but you see all sorts of things. Baltimore, for instance, where you're recording this from, many people noted that Freddie Gray was someone who had suffered from having a lot of lead in his blood. Well, in the census tracts surrounding the area where he's from, it is very routine to see 25, 30, 40, 50% of people who have these high, what are known as elevated blood levels, according to the EPA standards in terms of what is going on there in water. And in fact, Baltimore was a city where maybe not the only city, but one where there was reporting done on this by the Guardian and others, where the elevated lead levels seem to be multi-generational, which gives people a sense of how long these problems have been going on. But you look at even major, rich, wealthy cities like Chicago is currently in the process of trying to replace all of the main trunk water lines because they are so polluted with water. Now, the trick is that then there's also the lines that go from the streets, from the main line to your house. Many of those are also lead, but you can't get those replaced by the city. You have to pay for them yourself. So essentially, for those who are lower income people, they're being consigned in Chicago to having poisoned water, while wealthier individuals are having the water replaced. But I think we're seeing quite a bit. There's one school I found in upstate New York where they had one water fountain where there was 200% higher levels of lead in the water than what the EPA action level is. So, I mean, it really is an epidemic around the country.
Well, tell me, I heard you mention Milwaukee. What's the situation in Milwaukee?
Milwaukee has a similar issue with Chicago, where they have all these main trunk lines that are made out of lead. And so they're going back now trying to ultimately suppress it. When they did the study in Milwaukee, I think it was about 11.5% of the city overall where children tested for having elevated blood levels. But then when you look more on the north side of Milwaukee, which is the more heavily African-American area of the city, if people remember the uprising that happened a couple years ago, that was up there in the north side. Then you start to see, similar to places like Baltimore and Cleveland, the 40 to 50% of people, young people that they're testing here, who have elevated levels of lead in the blood. So it's very significant what we're seeing here in many of these areas and many of these communities. And Milwaukee is one of the most major, I think. There's currently a number of organizing efforts going on around this issue to replace all these lead pipes. They're replacing some, not all. There's also the issue of the trunk lines, as well as the lines that lead to the homes as well. But Milwaukee, for sure, especially on the north side, heavily victimized by that. And I really do think that is really the tail of the tape here, is that it's the areas where there are the largest conglomerations of low-income people, which oftentimes means Black and brown people, and then also rural areas where these things are happening. So it really is sort of a divide based on class and race for a lot of these problems as well, the millions of people affected by them.
Okay, I understand that obviously in places where there's wealth, people can afford to have those uh, lines from their house to the trunk line. They can afford to have those things replaced because they have the wealth to do that. What's the responsibility of cities, municipalities, to do that kind of replacement for people that are in poverty, low income people, so on? What's the responsibility? These cities, as far as I can tell, spending half of $1 billion sometime building stadiums and building all kinds of other infrastructure tourist kind of projects, and not taking care of the water that's affecting the children. What's the problem there?
Yeah, I think it's just pure avarice and greed on the part of these politicians, because they're really there to protect the interest of capital, the rich donors. I mean, you look at Chicago as one of the richest cities on earth. Mayor Rahm Emanuel does everything possible to attract all these big businesses. They want to give billions of dollars in tax breaks to Amazon. So it's not an issue of the money, it's an issue of the political will, the will to actually tax those. I mean, we're in the richest country in the history of countries. And if you look at what the American Society of Civil Engineers have put out in terms of water infrastructure and what the country nationwide would need to do, we're about $975 billion short of what we would need to do to make sure that all of our water is safe from these different lead issues. But, that's almost nothing. I mean, $975 billion. The Pentagon budget is, just the budget they tell you, $717 billion. We're spending $1 trillion over a number of years to revamp the entire nuclear weapons arsenal. You can't even get a hearing in this country when you talk about a 0.5% tax on every Wall Street transaction that could raise billions of dollars that could be put on this. A 1% increase and those who make money over $1 million. All you hear is tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. But I think your question is hitting in the right direction. What is the responsibility of society to make sure that people are not being poisoned? There is no safe level of lead to have in your water. There are EPA and state action levels where they're sort of saying, well, we think below this level, more or less, it's not going to be that bad. But really, any lead that gets in your bloodstream, especially for the young, especially for infants, can be extremely harmful, can cause all sorts of major issues in terms of mental and brain development as young people try to grow. So really, doesn't society have a responsibility to spend the money it takes to avoid, really mass poisoning of millions of people? But because the super rich who can afford to avoid this problem, if they want, most of these people with these $1 billion, all this kind of stuff, could have fresh water flown in from Fiji every day if that's what they wanted to do. But even, to the point of having their own water systems, to being able to replace water infrastructure, they can wall themselves off from this problem. And because the politicians don't have the political will in many of these cities and many of these states, and certainly not on the national level, to demand that people, put up their fair share to keep millions of people from being poisoned, that's why we're left with this problem. It's not a problem that we have to have. It's a problem that we are stuck with because we don't have the type of political system that is willing to actually invest in what needs to happen to have safe infrastructure here as it comes to water.
Earlier you mentioned that there was a couple thousand cases and several thousand census tract cases where that lead elevation is high, and you rightly so said it's poisoning, and of course it's poisoning, but this also concerns me that down the line, 5 years, 10 years from now, you'll have people with mental health problems, you'll have people with all sorts of physical ailments, and you'll have a potential situation in which you'll have violence as a result of this. So looking forward 10, 15 years from now, is this environmental genocide? Is this economic genocide? What is this?
Well, it's certainly a massive crime. I would call it a crime against humanity in many ways. People have to understand that lead is, in water a neurotoxin. And so especially for young people, it can have a serious impact on your brain development. And it can be, things as small as affecting attention span and things like that, to much more serious developmental defects. So yeah, you look 5-10 years down the line, there are a lot of people who could be having serious challenges. And whether it's just basic stuff like paying attention in class, which is something obviously you can get in other ways, but making it more difficult to learn, to much more serious learning and developmental disabilities. These are the types of things that can develop because of this. And I think that when we look at the multi-generational reality of this, we're not even understanding how some of these things that are coming from potential lead poisoning, partial lead poisoning, are playing out in terms of, how parents are transmitting certain behaviors to their children as well. And I mean, just be that as it may, I think the right to clean water, when water is one of the most important substances you have to have in your body, should be basic and de rigueur. So I think this is a huge health crisis. I think it really is a massive crime that this country doesn't, when it has all of the ability in the world to do so, doesn't want to address this issue.
Yeah, and from just my going to Flint and observing what happened there at Flint, this seemed to be a government-produced crisis. It seems that the government made a conscious decision to switch out the water sources and to put in poor quality water sources that eventually eroded the trunk lines as well as the house lines, deliberately to save money, but also it directed it to the poorest community, Benson Harbor, Flint, and surrounding areas that were poor communities of color. This was intentional. And so what concerns me is not that the government need to fix it, but what do we do about a government that creates it? They created a crisis and we are suffering the consequences, or people are suffering the consequences. And they're getting a smack on the wrist and they'll continue to create additional crisis. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think it speaks to the fact that we need a whole new social system in this country. I mean, I think you're exactly right. Not only was it deliberate, but I think their attitude was, and this is similar to the environmental racism we frequently see, whether it's incinerators, gas switching stations and the like, that they just don't think anyone's going to care. Well, there's just a bunch of poor black people or a bunch of poor brown people or Native American reservation, or quite frankly, even a bunch of poor white people. Like, who's really going to care about any of these people, about their health or whatever? And we need a new system where, the needs of people are prioritized over the needs of profit, where for the cutting of corners, people aren't looking for where's the easiest way to dump some problem on someone that no one cares about just so we can save a dollar here or there, but where we think, how do we keep everyone safe and how do we keep everyone living the best and the healthiest life they can. And I don't think that's going to happen under this sort of capitalist American system. And I think we really need to rethink not just the politicians we put in place, but the sort of deeper systemic realities that lead politicians to make these sorts of decisions like they did in Flint.
Okay, thank you. That's the last word on that. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, and I look forward to seeing you again in the near future.
Absolutely. Hoping for it myself and looking forward to it.
Okay, and thank you for joining the Real News.